The human brain is an incredible organ. But today, we are looking at 10 specific brains that completely short-circuited when exposed to an internet connection. We are counting down the 10 dumbest ways self-proclaimed truth seekers accidentally deleted themselves from reality while fighting imaginary enemies. Pro tip: if a warning label explicitly tells you that a machine will kill you, maybe don't treat it like a challenge issued by the deep state. 1. High up on a desolate ridge overlooking the sprawling suburbs sits a perfectly mundane piece of municipal infrastructure. But to a guy named Gary, this spinning white fiberglass dome wasn't a Doppler weather radar. It was a highly classified, government-funded brain scrambler. Gary possessed an internet connection vastly disproportionate to his critical thinking skills, genuinely believing the mild headaches he got from drinking too much cheap domestic beer were actually caused by a localized frequency weapon broadcasting directly into his skull. While normal people looked at a darkening thunderstorm and saw an excuse to cancel their outdoor golf plans, Gary looked at the same sky and saw a synchronized, atmospheric deployment designed to monitor his internal thoughts about tax evasion. He felt a deeply delusional duty to save his town from this invisible menace. Now, a quick lesson in municipal power grids. A standard weather radar simply uses radio waves to bounce off precipitation, but the heavy industrial electrical transformers required to spin that massive equipment handle enough raw voltage to power a small medieval village. They house the kind of ferocious electrical current that doesn't just shock a person, it abruptly and permanently evicts your soul from your physical body. Armed with nothing but a plastic tactical flashlight, a camouflage jacket with the discount tag still attached, and an ironclad belief in his unhinged internet theories, this basement-dwelling crusader hiked up the muddy incline on a stormy Tuesday night. Reaching the intimidating chain-link fence, Gary was immediately greeted by bright yellow signs screaming severe warnings about high voltage and certain death. In his conspiracy-addled mind, these weren't legitimate safety warnings. They were psychological deterrents placed by shadowy operatives terrified of a guy who still lived in his mother's basement. He hopped the wet fence with the awkward grace of a startled walrus, marched straight up to the humming electrical transformer box, and jimmied open the metal access door, revealing an intimidating labyrinth of thick power conduits humming with lethal energy. This is the exact moment any primal survival instinct should have desperately engaged the emergency brakes in his primate brain, but Gary confidently reached into his damp pocket and pulled out his weapon of choice: a pair of entirely uninsulated solid steel gardening shears. Muttering a cinematic one-liner about bringing down the corrupt system, Gary clamped the solid metal jaws directly over the thickest main power cable he could find and squeezed the handles together, instantly bridging the gap between thousands of volts of municipal electricity and the soggy mud he was standing in. The resulting flash of blistering blue-white light aggressively illuminated the dark hillside, instantly and permanently reclassifying Gary from a self-proclaimed resistance fighter to the most bizarre entry in the county coroner's annual case file. In an act of truly spectacular cosmic irony, the colossal arc caused a brief blackout, but the radar facility's automated backup generators kicked on flawlessly within seconds, booting the system back up just in time to capture a high-definition scan of the heavy storm front, rolling in directly over the exact charred patch of hillside where Gary had staged his fatally misguided one-man revolution. 2. Let me introduce you to Julian, a self-proclaimed holistic wellness guru whose relentless quest to completely detoxify his body from the modern world ultimately resulted in him aggressively toxifying himself right into the nearest underground mortuary. Julian had spent years tumbling down a deeply unhinged rabbit hole of internet paranoia, convincing himself that the perfectly safe tap water flowing into his apartment was actually an insidious chemical cocktail. He truly believed it was laced with mind-controlling fluoride designed by global elites to calcify his pineal gland and crush his spiritual awakening. Because filtering his municipal water was entirely too mainstream for a guy who unironically wore braided hemp sandals in the dead of winter, Julian declared absolute war on modern sanitation. He vowed to only hydrate his physical vessel with what he proudly called living ancestral raw water. What Julian failed to understand is that the entire reason humanity invented water purification systems is because Mother Nature is teeming with microscopic assassins who want nothing more than to use your intestines as a warm biological breeding ground. Undeterred by basic human history or the sobering concept of cholera, this unyielding wellness warrior grabbed 3 glass jugs and drove out to the rural outskirts of his county. Bypassing several state park rivers he was convinced were already contaminated by federal treatment facilities upstream. He pulled over near a sprawling commercial dairy farm and confidently marched past the confused cattle toward a stagnant agricultural runoff pond he mistakenly identified as a natural groundwater spring. This wasn't a pristine natural spring. It was a hazardous, lukewarm soup of heavy cow manure, chemical fertilizer, and decaying vegetation radiating an odor that resembled a neglected, sun-baked porta potty. Treating this festering puddle of biological hazard like the fountain of youth, Julian waded in and eagerly filled his jugs with the murky brown liquid, totally ignoring the glaring fact that even the local insect population had evacuated the premises. Later that afternoon, Julian sat in front of his LED ring light, broadcasting a live video to his entirely confused internet followers. He enthusiastically chugged a giant glass of his untreated swamp juice, loudly praising its earthy flavor profile and the undeniable tingling sensation it gave the back of his throat. Unfortunately, that earthy tingle wasn't a sudden burst of untamed cosmic energy. It was a highly aggressive invasion force of severe waterborne pathogens, weaponized E. coli, and agricultural toxins throwing an epic frat party inside his dreadfully unprepared digestive tract. Within 36 hours of his triumphant holistic victory lap, Julian's internal organs collectively waved the white flag of surrender, thrusting him into a catastrophic nightmare of explosive dehydration and total systemic organ failure. He managed to unintentionally speedrun a highly fatal case of medieval dysentery in the middle of the 21st century. The bitter punchline to Julian's entirely self-inflicted crusade was delivered in a sterile emergency room, where panicked doctors desperately flooded his failing system with gallons of heavily sterilized, thoroughly regulated, and highly fluoridated hospital-grade saline solution before his medical monitor predictably and permanently flatlined. 3. There is an incredibly dangerous breed of internet scholar who looks at basic civil engineering and decides the laws of physics are merely polite suggestions imposed by an illegitimate government. Unfortunately for the local paramedics, a man named Arthur was their undisputed king. Arthur was a hardcore sovereign citizen who genuinely believed that because he filed some made-up paperwork using red ink and a thumbprint, he was magically immune to local building codes. He loudly insisted these safety regulations were actually fake maritime laws, completely inapplicable to a free man. His paranoia reached a fever pitch after he convinced himself that commercial airplanes flying over his property were actually Black Ops United Nations stealth helicopters deployed to monitor his backyard. This delusion sparked a desperate need for a high-altitude reconnaissance outpost of his own. If you were going to build a structure meant to securely elevate a human being several stories into the air, standard construction practice strongly dictates the use of load-bearing timbers, steel bolts, and a rudimentary grasp of structural mechanics. Gravity is an entirely undefeated force of nature that absolutely does not care about your radical political ideology. Disregarding structural integrity as a deep-state conspiracy meant to keep men grounded, Arthur began constructing a towering 3-story observation deck behind his garage. He utilized an astoundingly dangerous mishmash of rotted scrap wood liberated from a defunct pallet factory and a criminal lack of actual metal fasteners. Instead of using steel nails or heavy-duty screws, this self-appointed structural genius boldly lashed the entire wobbling monstrosity together, using hundreds of plastic zip ties, an excessive amount of duct tape, and sheer anti-government defiance. As the rickety wooden nightmare climbed precariously higher, it took on the alarming appearance of a heavily intoxicated Jenga tower. It swayed and groaned menacingly every time a gentle breeze rolled through, prompting terrified neighbors to beg him to stop before he killed himself. Arthur scoffed at their warnings, leaning over a taped-together railing to scream confusing quotes from an obscure naval treaty regarding the freedom of the open sky. The totally inevitable climax of this architectural horror show arrived on a mildly breezy Tuesday when Arthur, armed with binoculars, proudly stomped his heavy boots up to the very top platform to begin his vigilant watch. The exact millisecond his full adult body weight transferred onto the highest, most precariously secured wooden tier. The unyielding laws of physics forcefully audited his bizarre construction methods. Hundreds of tightly strained plastic zip ties simultaneously snapped in a deafening, unified symphony of catastrophic failure. The entire three-story deck instantly pancaked inward, collapsing straight down into a suffocating pile of jagged kindling and thoroughly burying Arthur beneath a heavy mountain of his own arrogant DIY stupidity. When emergency crews arrived to dig him out of the catastrophic pile of splintered wreckage, a bewildered neighbor giving an official statement noted a deeply ironic final detail. As Arthur plummeted 30 feet toward the hard earth, he spent his entire freefall loudly screaming at the top of his lungs that the local government had cowardly targeted his tower with an illegal, invisible gravitational ray weapon. 4. The portable gasoline generator. A modern marvel of backup electricity. But in the aggressively paranoid hands of a doomsday prepper named Dale, it rapidly transformed from a handy power source into a highly efficient one-way ticket to the afterlife. Dale dedicated the last decade of his life to preparing for a chaotic societal collapse, stockpiling enough freeze-dried beef stroganoff, water purification tablets, and military surplus ammunition to comfortably outlast a localized alien invasion or a nuclear winter. Unfortunately, he completely forgot to prepare for his own staggering lack of basic high school chemistry knowledge. His primary, all-consuming obsession was a profound paranoia regarding high-altitude government surveillance drones equipped with advanced thermal imaging cameras. This persistent internet-fueled delusion convinced him shadowy federal agents were constantly scanning the rural canopy, searching exclusively for the glowing heat signature of his underground corrugated steel bunker. Now, for those of us who operate in reality, internal combustion engines are incredibly simple machines. They burn fossil fuels to generate electricity, and in doing so, they pump out massive clouds of carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless gas that permanently unplugs your brain from the mortal coil. Any standard portable gas generator comes with a small library of brightly colored warning labels, begging the consumer to never operate the machinery inside an enclosed space. Dale proudly viewed manufacturer safety warnings as deep-state propaganda designed to make him trackable to the government. He made the phenomenally idiotic executive decision to drag his brand-new 9,000-watt gasoline generator straight down the narrow ladder and park it right in the center of his claustrophobic, unventilated subterranean fortress. To ensure flawless thermal invisibility from the imaginary drones circling his unkempt property, this bunker-dwelling mastermind didn't just close the heavy steel blast hatch above him. He grabbed 3 large cans of industrial-strength expanding aerosol polyurethane foam and sealed up every single air intake pipe and surface exhaust vent. He effectively transformed his precious underground survival fortress into a flawlessly airtight, incredibly expensive underground tomb. Believing he had finally outsmarted the entire global intelligence community, Dale yanked the starter cord. The engine roared to life, filling the small concrete room with power and immediately unleashing a concentrated tidal wave of lethal exhaust fumes directly into his contained breathing supply. He sat back in his tactical recliner and cracked open a lukewarm canned beverage to celebrate his brilliant evasion tactics. He felt like an absolute mastermind, completely unaware that he was hotboxing his own lungs with a deadly poison. Within 20 minutes, the rapidly accumulating carbon monoxide silently rocked him into a deep, permanent slumber. The spectacular irony of Dale's hyper-vigilant survival strategy peaked when the coroner finalized his report. His official cause of death wasn't a shadowy government assassination or a global nuclear fallout, but a self-administered, highly concentrated dose of automotive exhaust. Dale had successfully engineered a flawlessly impenetrable bunker that protected him from every imaginary threat in the outside world, effectively ensuring his own quiet demise, courtesy of his room temperature IQ. 5. The internet harbors a rapidly expanding corner heavily populated by arrogant holistic wellness influencers who genuinely believe fundamental medical science is a massive corporate hoax. And a man named Silas proudly served as their undisputed frontline general. Silas was a deeply entrenched adherent to a bizarre online philosophy known as terrain theory. This thoroughly debunked pseudoscience claims contagious viruses literally do not exist, and all human illnesses are simply caused by a temporary imbalance of your body's natural frequencies and a severe lack of organic kale smoothies. He firmly believed the entire concept of infectious disease was just a lucrative fairy tale peddled by the pharmaceutical industry to sell toxic vaccines to the gullible masses. This disconnected worldview faced the ultimate biological audit one muggy summer evening when Silas ventured up into his dusty attic to retrieve a vintage lamp entangled with an erratic, foaming-at-the-mouth brown bat. The thrashing nocturnal mammal latched onto Silas's left forearm before he managed to swat it away into the darkness, leaving behind two distinct puncture wounds that practically screamed for immediate modern medical intervention. Here is a sobering lesson in virology for the holistic crowd. Rabies is not a mild seasonal sniffle or a passing stomach bug. It is a microscopic apex predator, a terrifyingly efficient neurological assassin that travels up your nervous system to your brain, boasting a completely undefeated 100% fatality rate if you do not receive the post-exposure shots. Any normal human being possessing even a shred of primal survival instinct would have sprinted out of that house and shattered every local traffic law, racing to the nearest emergency room. Silas, however, scoffed at the idea of letting the medical establishment pump his pristine, alkaline temple full of synthetic poison. He opted instead to calmly march down to his bathroom cabinet and treat the rabid animal bite with a proprietary topical blend of raw lavender extract, crushed eucalyptus leaves, and positive healing affirmations. He spent the next 3 weeks bragging on his podcast about how his superior biological terrain completely neutralized the imaginary threat. That triumphant narrative abruptly ended the exact moment he attempted to take a simple sip from a glass of tap water and discovered his throat violently spasming in sheer terror. By the time the terrifying symptoms of advanced hydrophobia fully took hold, prompting a frantic ambulance ride to the intensive care unit, his beloved essential oils were completely useless against the physical destruction of his brainstem. The tragic punchline to his lifelong anti-science crusade was delivered in a sterilized isolation ward where an entirely preventable ancient virus completely dismantled his nervous system. He spent his final days strapped to a hospital bed, a captive audience to the reality of the germ theory he had mocked for a decade. It served as a brutal, agonizing reminder that Mother Nature's microscopic assassins fundamentally do not care about your podcast statistics or your preferred brand of aromatherapy. 6. If you spend enough uninterrupted time mindlessly scrolling through the darkest algorithmic basements of social media, you will eventually encounter a shockingly large demographic of people who wholeheartedly embrace the wildly absurd conspiracy theory that birds are not actually biological animals. A man named Travis was a heavily radicalized champion of this exact movement, a guy who routinely stood outside local municipal parks shouting through a cheap plastic megaphone that pigeons and sparrows were actually sophisticated government surveillance drones deployed to spy on the American public. He convinced himself the feathery plumage of an eagle was merely an acoustic dampener designed to hide internal spy microphones, and the only reason birds sat on high-voltage power lines was to wirelessly recharge their lithium-ion battery packs. Fed up with simply arguing with highly confused strangers on the internet, Travis boldly decided to secure the undeniable physical proof required to blow the lid off the entire global avian conspiracy. He targeted a colossal, intimidating red-tailed hawk's nest situated precariously near the very top of a towering 60-foot dying pine tree in his local nature reserve. Unlike digital gadgets, a biological mother hawk doesn't have an off switch or a reboot sequence. She operates exclusively on maternal fury and armor-piercing talons designed to shred intruders. Willfully ignoring the fundamental concept of gravity and the sheer danger of an apex predator, this unhinged bird denier marched to the base of the gigantic tree, wearing nothing but a pair of cargo shorts and a GoPro strapped tightly to his forehead. He possessed zero safety ropes, zero climbing harnesses, and absolute zero functional common sense. Sweating and panting, Travis awkward climbed his way up the sticky, sap-covered branches, ascending higher into the dangerous canopy until he was swaying terrifyingly in the wind, mere inches away from what he firmly believed was a classified federal charging station. Just as he reached his bare hand directly into the massive pile of twigs, Fully intending to rip the memory cards right out of the baby drones, the biological mother hawk returned from her hunting trip with a vengeance. Reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour in a dive, the angry raptor delivered a full-speed aerial assault directly to the back of Travis's completely unprotected head. A blinding, highly organic reality check that instantly shattered his digital delusions. Screaming in sheer panic and flailing his arms wildly to fight off the relentlessly attacking bird, Travis entirely lost his precarious, slippery grip on the thick pine branch. He immediately discovered firsthand that while birds might be highly controversial in his specific internet chat rooms, the unyielding laws of gravity remain entirely undisputed. He plummeted 60 feet through the unforgiving branches, taking one final spectacular flight to the forest floor below. He left behind a damaged action camera that perfectly captured his sudden, terrifying realization that the local wildlife was incredibly real and absolutely not running on batteries. 7. Have you ever looked at a perfectly flat, solid concrete garage floor and thought, you know what this really needs? A structurally compromised 15-foot medieval death pit? Meet Greg, a man who answered that question with an enthusiastic yes. He spent thousands of hours plunging down unregulated internet rabbit holes, eventually convincing his malleable brain that the concrete foundation of his two-car garage sat directly above a VIP entrance to Agartha. For those uninitiated in the fringes of online lunacy, Agartha is the legendary subterranean utopia central to the Hollow Earth theory, a supposed underground paradise teeming with advanced aliens, glowing crystal cities, and a distinct lack of federal income tax. Rather than enjoying a science fiction novel like a well-adjusted adult, Greg viewed this fabricated lore as an actionable real estate opportunity. He decided to launch a unilateral, illegal excavation project right next to his lawnmower to establish diplomatic relations with his imaginary subterranean neighbors. Anyone who has ever built a sandcastle instinctively understands the foundational mechanics of loose earth. Soil is heavy, dense, and possesses a relentless, gravity-driven desire to collapse inward at the first available opportunity. Professional civil engineers use massive steel trench boxes, hydraulic shoring, and complex physics to prevent the heavy earth from reclaiming the empty space they dig. Greg, armed with zero construction experience and an astonishing level of unearned confidence, viewed these safety measures as unnecessary financial hurdles created by the deep state. He marched into a local heavy equipment rental yard, secured a compact industrial backhoe, tore up his concrete floor, and began carving a sheer, 15-foot vertical shaft straight down into the soft, sandy loam of his neighborhood. He refused to install a single piece of retaining wood, a solitary steel brace, or even a polite suggestion of structural support. He essentially engineered a textbook medieval death trap in his own driveway. For 3 grueling days, he burrowed deeper into the dark hole, filling countless buckets with loose dirt while gleefully muttering to himself about his imminent first contact with the enlightened mole people. The undefeated laws of physics audited his unauthorized mining operation on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Standing proudly at the bottom of his dirt pit of sheer stupidity, Greg chipped away at a soft pocket of foundational sand. Without a single warning crack or groan, the structural integrity of the entire unreinforced vertical shaft experienced a catastrophic failure. Tens of thousands of pounds of compacted earth liquefied and folded inward in a fraction of a second. The massive cave-in filled the void, burying our amateur spelunker beneath a suffocating mountain of his own front yard before he could even draw a breath to scream. When rescue crews arrived on the scene, they took one sobering look at the sunken crater inside the garage and immediately transitioned from an active rescue mission to a localized archaeological dig. They spent hours extracting him from the rubble, uncovering the tragic reality that the only permanent underground residency Greg managed to secure was a highly traditional, remarkably shallow, and entirely non-mythical grave. 8. Out on a treacherous, winding Appalachian mountain pass, a fiercely anti-technology traveler named Roy declared absolute war on modern navigation and promptly lost his life in the skirmish. Roy belonged to a paranoid subset of sovereign citizens who harbored a deep, unshakable belief that the global positioning system was not a helpful satellite network designed to find the nearest drive-through, but rather a nefarious federal tracking grid. He felt convinced that every digital map app was programmed to route free-thinking patriots directly into secret, heavily guarded FEMA re-education camps. Refusing to become a victim of this imaginary digital kidnapping, Roy tossed his smartphone into a river and embraced the ancient, discredited art of ley line navigation. Ley lines, for the uninitiated, are hypothetical alignments of geographical landmarks that mystic enthusiasts believe pulse with magical earth energy. Roy spent weeks huddled over a stained paper map, using a plastic protractor, a glowing amethyst crystal pendulum, and pure delusion to chart a foolproof, government-evading route across the country. This bizarre commitment to prehistoric orienteering led him to navigate a notoriously dangerous, weather-beaten mountain road at 2 o'clock in the morning. This specific stretch of elevated highway possessed a terrifying reputation for sheer cliff drops and zero guardrails, demanding absolute focus and bright headlights. Roy, however, had killed his headlights miles back to avoid detection by the satellite tracking grid, navigating his massive pickup truck by nothing but the pale glow of his dashboard, keeping one eye on the barely visible asphalt and the other firmly glued to his scribbled array of magical energy vectors. The county highway department had placed 3 visible, reflective concrete road barricades across his path, accompanied by massive flashing orange signs, explicitly warning motorists that the upcoming bridge had washed out during a recent storm. To a rational driver, these barriers signal a life-or-death mandate to hit the brakes and turn around. To Roy, these glowing municipal warnings were obvious, deep-state illusions, fake physical deterrents placed by federal agents attempting to force him off his sacred energy path and steer him toward a digital trap. Smirking at his own perceived brilliance, Roy slammed his heavy work boot down on the accelerator, gripped the steering wheel, and bypassed the concrete barriers, following his crystal-dictated route straight into the pitch-black void. The magical earth energy he relied upon failed to materialize a solid surface beneath his screeching tires. The heavy truck launched off the jagged, broken edge of the ruined bridge, achieving a brief, majestic moment of flight before gravity harshly intervened. He plummeted hundreds of feet down into the dark, rocky ravine below, experiencing a devastating lesson in the unyielding reality of structural engineering. The twisted wreckage of his truck was discovered the next morning by a local surveyor, serving as a brutal reminder that while magical energy grids might look fantastic on a fantasy novel map, they offer zero aerodynamic support when you intentionally drive a 3-ton motorized vehicle off a sheer mountain cliff at 60 miles per hour. 9. There is a special, highly concentrated flavor of internet madness that looks at basic municipal plumbing and sees a luxury underground resort for shape-shifting reptilian overlords. Leon wasn't just casually sipping this flavor of madness, he was chugging it by the gallon. Leon was a radicalized subscriber to the lizard people hypothesis, a bizarre, internet theory claiming the world's political and financial elite are actually shape-shifting, interdimensional reptilian overlords wearing human skin suits. He bypassed the standard online forums and convinced himself that the massive concrete storm drains running underneath his metropolis were not designed to manage rainwater, but actually functioned as a sprawling subterranean breeding bunker and luxury lounge for these cold-blooded masters. Determined to capture undeniable high-definition footage of the scaly elite, Leon strapped a waterproof action camera to his chest, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight, and descended through a rusted maintenance manhole cover into the pitch-black, echoing labyrinth of the city's runoff infrastructure. Municipal storm drains are incredible feats of civil engineering, cavernous concrete arteries built with a singular violent purpose: to channel millions of gallons of torrential rainwater away from the streets to prevent catastrophic urban flooding. They are the absolute last place on Earth a human being should stand during a precipitation event. Leon actively ignored 3 consecutive days of blaring smartphone emergency alerts, severe municipal flash flood warnings, and frantic meteorologists practically begging residents to seek high ground. In his paranoid, lizard-obsessed brain, the local news stations were obviously controlled by the reptilian cabal, and the weather alerts were merely a fabricated scare tactic designed specifically to keep truth seekers away from the underground bunkers. Armed with staggering ignorance, he waded ankle-deep into the murky trickles of the tunnel, pointing his flashlight into the gloom and demanding the reptilian elite show themselves. The universe, devoid of any shape-shifting lizards but heavily stocked with incoming atmospheric rivers, obliged his desire for a dramatic encounter. A massive torrential downpour struck the city's surface with biblical fury. Within minutes, the scattered puddles around Leon's boots transformed into a surging, deafening roar, echoing down the concrete corridor. A solid, 10-foot-high wall of churning, debris-filled black water tore around the blind corner, moving with the unstoppable kinetic force of a runaway freight train. Leon had roughly 2 seconds to realize the local meteorologists were incredibly accurate before the colossal surge of raw aquatic power slammed into him. The sheer mechanical force of the raging flash flood swept him clean off his feet and sent him hurtling helplessly into the dark, churning depths of the subterranean runoff network, ending his reptilian investigation with permanent and absolute finality. He was unceremoniously flushed out into the open bay hours later, becoming a tragic, soggy testament to the undeniable fact that 1 million gallons of fast-moving urban runoff cares absolutely nothing about your quest to expose the lizard Illuminati. 10. At the absolute peak of a historically violent Atlantic hurricane season, a prominent Flat Earth Forum moderator named Todd decided it was time to expose the global meteorological conspiracy, a bold choice that rapidly transformed him into fish food. Todd was a vocal champion of an incredibly specific, mind-bending delusion. He firmly believed the Earth resembled a giant icy dinner plate, and that massive natural disasters were fabricated events. He theorized that severe hurricanes were merely sophisticated, government-funded CGI holograms projected onto the firmament to terrorize citizens and physically block them from sailing out to discover the towering ice wall at the edge of the world. Refusing to cower before a giant government laser show, Todd decided to sail directly into the belly of the beast to capture video evidence of the massive projector lenses he believed were floating in the sky. Venturing out into the open ocean requires a heavily reinforced vessel, a seasoned crew, and a profound respect for the chaotic power of nature. Todd possessed none of these things. He marched down to a private marina and rented a flimsy aluminum flat-bottomed fishing skiff, a tiny recreational boat explicitly designed for catching bass in calm, shallow lakes, not for surviving apocalyptic oceanic warfare. The local Coast Guard had been broadcasting frantic sirens and red flag emergency mandates all morning, ordering every single vessel to return to port immediately as a monstrous Category 3 hurricane barreled toward the coastline. Todd smugly dismissed these maritime warnings as orchestrated deep state theater, cranked the sputtering outboard motor of his tiny John boat, and steered past the concrete breakwater into the churning, darkening sea. He stood proudly at the bow, with his smartphone raised toward the ominous, swirling black clouds, shouting triumphant challenges at the imaginary federal agents he believed were operating the sky projectors. The Atlantic Ocean, blissfully unaware of his internet clout and very much a tangible, non-holographic entity, delivered a swift and brutal reality check. As the outer bands of the hurricane hit, the wind shifted from a stiff breeze to a deafening, 100-mile-per-hour roar that stripped the surface water into blinding spray. Before Todd could adjust his camera settings, the ocean reared up and birthed a terrifying, 15-foot rogue wave, a towering wall of dense, crushing saltwater moving with the destructive force of a collapsing building. The massive swell slammed down directly on top of his fragile aluminum skiff, pulverizing the tiny vessel into twisted metallic toothpicks. The sheer kinetic impact of millions of gallons of water shattered the flimsy boat and dragged this aggressively stubborn forum moderator deep beneath the churning, unforgiving surface, definitively ending his doomed maritime expedition. Todd ultimately secured irrefutable first-hand proof of the ocean's terrifying physical density, leaving behind only a few floating pieces of aluminum debris to serve as a grim warning about the fatal consequences of treating a Category 3 hurricane like a digital light show. The comment section is now a supreme court of logic. Which of these 10 absolute, undisputed legends is most directly responsible for single-handedly lowering the global average IQ? Give me your final verdict. If you prefer breathing fresh oxygen over conducting underground generator experiments, click subscribe and like. Right now, before the digital simulation we all live in gets permanently rebooted.